The lone figure of Zachary Powell cast a long shadow across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory as he returned from another day of riding the fence line, the setting sun of 1876 painting the mountains in hues that no longer moved him. It had been 3 years since he'd spoken more than a handful of words to another soul, 3 years since the Cheyenne raid that had taken his young wife and infant son, leaving nothing behind but ash where his hopes had once stood. His new cabin, built with hands that worked until they bled just to keep his thoughts at bay, stood solitary against the vastness of the range. 20 acres, a small herd of cattle, and silence were all that remained of a life once filled with promise. At 32, Zach had retreated so far into himself that the townsfolk of nearby Timber Creek had taken to calling him the Ghost on the rare occasions he rode in for supplies. He dismounted from his chestnut gelding, removing the saddle with practiced motions. The horse, the only living creature he spoke to these days, nickered softly as Zach patted its flank before leading it into the small stable attached to the cabin. "Good work today, Thunder," he murmured, the words feeling foreign in his throat. After tending to the horse, he trudged to the cabin, shoulders hunched against the early spring chill. Inside, the barren room greeted him as it always did: a well-swept floor, a neatly made bed, a clean table with a single chair, and a stone fireplace that gave warmth but no comfort. A shelf held 3 books he'd read countless times, and his wife's silver hairbrush sat untouched on a trunk, the only reminder he allowed himself of Sarah. He built a fire, prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, and ate mechanically, while staring at the flames. Another day ending like all the others, indistinguishable from the hundreds before it, promising nothing different for the hundreds to come. But fate, which had already dealt Zachary Powell one cruel hand, was about to shuffle the deck again. Dawn broke with the distant rumble of wagon wheels. Zach was already awake, having slept fitfully, as he always did. The sound, so unusual on his remote property, brought him to the door, rifle in hand. Approaching his cabin was a covered wagon, listing badly to one side with a broken wheel. A slender figure in a blue dress stood beside it, attempting to calm a pair of clearly exhausted horses. Zach watched, unmoving, as the woman, for he could now see it was indeed a woman, patted the horses' necks and spoke in soothing tones. She hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on her immediate predicament. He considered retreating inside, ignoring the intrusion entirely. Strangers brought complications, conversation, questions he had no interest in answering. But the broken wheel meant she was stranded, and despite everything, he remained enough of the man his father had raised not to leave a woman alone on the frontier. With a reluctant sigh, he set his rifle against the doorframe and stepped into the morning light. The woman turned at his approach, and Zach felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a moment of pure surprise. She was young, perhaps 25, with copper-colored hair escaping from beneath a sensible bonnet. Her face, lightly freckled across the nose and cheeks, was pretty in a lively way, with intelligent green eyes that immediately assessed him. "Oh, thank heavens," she exclaimed. "I was beginning to think I'd have to fix this myself, and I'm afraid my wheelwright skills are sorely lacking." Zach stared at her, unaccustomed to such direct address. Words formed and died in his throat. The woman's smile faltered slightly at his silence, but she pressed on. "I'm Delilah Crawford. I was headed to my uncle's place near Timber Creek when this happened." She gestured at the broken wheel. "Would you be so kind as to point me toward the nearest blacksmith?" "Timber Creek's 20 miles west," Zach finally managed, his voice rough from disuse. "Will won't make it." Delilah Crawford's shoulders slumped momentarily before she straightened them with visible resolve. "Well then, Mr. Powell. Zachary Powell. Mr. Powell. It seems I'm in need of assistance. I can pay for your help and any materials needed." Zach looked from the woman to the wagon and back again. Every instinct told him to send her on her way, But the practical reality was unavoidable. She couldn't continue her journey without repairs, and night would fall long before she could reach town on foot. "I can fix it," he said at last. "Take a day or two." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you. I'm very grateful." He nodded once and moved toward the wagon to assess the damage. The wheel had split along a weak point in the wood, and the axle was bent but salvageable. As he examined it, he became aware of her watching him. "Do you live alone out here, Mr. Powell?" she asked. He stood, wiping his hands on his worn denims. "Yes. It's beautiful country. Remote, though." Zach didn't respond, instead turning toward his workshop, a lean-to attached to the far side of the stable. "I'll need to reshape the axle." "You can." He faltered, unaccustomed to hosting anyone. "Water's in the barrel by the door if you need it." With that, he retreated to his workshop, grateful for the excuse to escape conversation. Through the open doorway, he watched as Delilah unloaded a small trunk and satchel from the wagon, speaking soothingly to her horses before unhitching them and leading them to the water trough. She moved with purpose and efficiency, clearly no stranger to handling the practicalities of frontier travel. When she caught him watching, she offered a smile that caused him to quickly look away, focusing intently on gathering the tools he would need. The next few hours passed in a rhythm of work punctuated by Delilah's occasional questions, most of which Zach answered with a word or two at most. She seemed undeterred by his reticence, filling the silence with observations about her journey from St. Louis, her uncle's recent letters describing the opportunities in Wyoming Territory, and the troublesome wheel that had been repaired once already in Cheyenne. By midday, Zach had removed the damaged wheel and was working on straightening the axle when Delilah approached with a tin cup. "I hope you don't mind," she said, offering him the coffee. "I took the liberty of using your stove." He accepted the cup with a nod, surprised to find the coffee properly brewed, strong but not bitter, the way he preferred it. "I also made some cornbread," she continued. "It's nothing fancy, but it might make a decent lunch with whatever you were planning." Zach stared at her, momentarily at a loss. It had been so long since anyone had cooked in his cabin, since he'd shared a meal with another person. The simple gesture of hospitality in his own home, no less, felt foreign, almost intrusive. Yet something about her straightforward manner made refusal seem churlish. "Thank you," he managed. They ate on the cabin's small porch, Delilah filling the silence with tales of her journey west. She had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis, she explained, but her uncle's illness had prompted her journey to Wyoming. With no immediate family left in Missouri after her parents' deaths, she had decided to make a fresh start. "Uncle Frank owns the general store in Timber Creek," she said between bites. "He's getting on in years and has no children of his own. He's offered me a place to live and work in the store." She smiled ruefully. "Though I must admit, I'm not entirely certain he knows what he's getting into. I've been told I'm rather opinionated for a woman." Zach found himself listening despite his usual disinterest in others' affairs. There was something compelling about Delilah Crawford, a frankness, an absence of pretense that reminded him of the Wyoming landscape itself. Honest, unvarnished, revealing itself plainly to those who cared to look. As the afternoon wore on, Zach worked steadily on the wheel while Delilah busied herself with her own tasks, occasionally bringing him water or asking practical questions about his progress. When the light began to fade, he realized he faced an uncomfortable dilemma. "Will won't be ready until tomorrow," he said, setting down his tools. "You can." He hesitated, then steeled himself. "You can take the cabin tonight. I'll sleep in the stable." Delilah looked genuinely distressed at the suggestion. "I couldn't possibly displace you from your home, Mr. Powell. The wagon has my bedroll, and I've certainly slept in less comfortable circumstances on my journey." "Not proper," Zach insisted. "Night gets cold." She considered him for a moment, head tilted slightly. "Perhaps we could compromise. Your cabin appears to have ample room for both of us to maintain proper distance. I assure you, my reputation can withstand the arrangement given the circumstances, and I trust you are a gentleman." Zach felt a flush creep up his neck at the directness of her assessment. "Yes, madam." "Delilah, please," she corrected with a small smile. "If we're to share accommodations, however temporarily, we might as well dispense with formalities." That night, after a simple supper that somehow tasted better than anything Zach had eaten in years, he found himself in the strange position of lying on a pallet near the fireplace while Delilah occupied his bed, a blanket hung between them for propriety. The cabin, usually silent save for the crackle of the fire, now contained the soft sounds of another person's breathing. "Zachary," came her voice through the darkness, "may I ask you something?" He considered feigning sleep, but found himself answering, "Yes." "How long have you lived alone out here?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, yet weighted with implications. 3 years, he finally said. "It must get lonely." Zach stared at the rafters, watching firelight play across the wood. "Got used to it." There was a long pause, and he thought perhaps she had fallen asleep. Then, "I don't think people ever really get used to loneliness. We just learn to carry it." The simple truth of her words struck him with unexpected force. He had nothing to say in response, and eventually, Delilah's breathing deepened into sleep, leaving Zach awake with thoughts he'd long avoided. Morning brought a return to work on the wheel, but something had shifted. Zach found himself answering Delilah's questions more fully, occasionally even volunteering information about the land, the weather patterns, the small herd of cattle he maintained. At midday, when she brought him lunch, he surprised himself by asking about her plans for the store. "Uncle Frank's idea is for me to take over the ledgers initially," she explained, sitting on a nearby stump. "But I have some notions about expanding the inventory to include more books and educational materials. This country is growing, and children need proper schooling." "Not much call for books out here," Zach remarked. Delilah's eyes sparkled with challenge. "Perhaps because they're not readily available. I believe even the most practical rancher might enjoy a good novel during the long winter months. Wouldn't you?" Zach thought of his 3 well-worn books. "Maybe. You see? And I'd wager there are families in these parts who worry about their children's education. I'm hoping to eventually open a proper school in Timber Creek." Her enthusiasm was contagious, and Zach found himself imagining the town with a schoolhouse, picturing children with books instead of just ranch work ahead of them. It seemed a distant possibility, yet Delilah spoke of it with such certainty that doubts seemed misplaced. By late afternoon, the wheel was repaired, the axle straightened and reinforced. Together, they mounted it onto the wagon and secured it properly. Zach checked the other wheels, finding them sound enough for the journey to town. "There," he said, stepping back to survey their work. "Should hold." Delilah beamed at him, genuine gratitude in her expression. "I can't thank you enough, Zachary. What do I owe you for the repairs?" He shook his head. "Nothing. I insist on compensating you for your time and materials." "No need," he said firmly. "Wheels fixed. You should reach town before dark if you leave now." A shadow of what might have been disappointment crossed her face, quickly replaced by a practical nod. "You're right, of course. I should take advantage of the remaining daylight." She gathered her belongings, repacked the wagon, and hitched her horses with Zach's help. When everything was ready, she turned to him with an extended hand. "Thank you for your hospitality, Zachary Powell. I'm very glad our paths crossed." He took her hand briefly, the contact sending an unexpected jolt through him. "Safe travels." She climbed onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and with a final smile, set the horses in motion. Zach stood watching until the wagon crested the rise that would take it out of sight, feeling strangely hollow as the distance between them grew. Only when he turned back to his cabin did he realize how silent it seemed now, how empty. 2 weeks passed, and Zach found himself in the unusual position of thinking about someone other than his lost family. Delilah Crawford's brief presence had somehow disturbed the careful numbness he'd cultivated, leaving him restless and irritable. He told himself it was merely the disruption to his routine, nothing more. Yet when a supply run to town became necessary, he found himself paying more attention to his appearance than he had in years, trimming his beard and donning his least-worn shirt before riding thunder toward Timber Creek. The town had grown since his last visit 6 months ago. New buildings lined the main street, including what appeared to be a freshly painted schoolhouse at the far end. Zach tied Thunder at the hitching post outside the general store, steeling himself for the interaction to come. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door. Inside, the store was transformed from the dusty, poorly organized space he remembered. Shelves were neatly arranged, goods displayed logically, and a small section near the back now featured books and writing materials. Behind the counter stood a gray-haired man Zach recognized as Frank Crawford, and beside him, sorting through a box of inventory, was Delilah. She looked up at the sound of the bell, and her face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Zachary, what a wonderful surprise." Frank Crawford glanced between them with interest. "So, you're the Good Samaritan who helped my niece with her wagon. She's spoken quite highly of you, Mr. Powell." Zach nodded uncomfortably, unaccustomed to being the center of attention. "Just needed supplies," he muttered, producing his list. "Of course," Delilah said, taking the paper from him. "Uncle Frank, would you mind if I helped Mr. Powell gather his items? I'm still learning the inventory, and this would be good practice." The older man waved them on with a knowing smile that Zach pretended not to notice. As they moved through the store, Delilah chatted easily about her first weeks in Timber Creek, the people she'd met, her progress with organizing the store, and her plans for the schoolhouse. "It was just sitting empty," she explained as she reached for a sack of coffee beans. "The town built it 2 years ago, but they've had trouble keeping a teacher. I've convinced the town council to let me open it properly come fall." "Seems you've been busy," Zach observed, finding it easier to talk with her than he'd expected. "I believe in making oneself useful," she replied with a smile. "And speaking of useful, I have something for you." She disappeared briefly into the back room, returning with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "A thank you for your help." Zach accepted it awkwardly. "Wasn't necessary. Open it anyway." Inside was a book, a new copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Zach ran his fingers over the embossed cover, momentarily speechless. "It was just published last year," Delilah explained. "I thought you might enjoy it during those quiet evenings." The thoughtfulness of the gift caught him off guard. "Thank you," he managed, carefully rewrapping the book. As he paid for his supplies, Frank Crawford insisted on including several fresh-baked goods on the house, despite Zach's protests. Before he left, Delilah walked him to the door. "The town's holding a social next Saturday evening," she said, "to celebrate the schoolhouse. There'll be food and music." She hesitated, then added, "I'd be very pleased if you would attend." Zach's instinct was to refuse immediately. He hadn't attended a social gathering since before Sarah's death, had no desire to endure the awkward glances and whispered comments his presence would surely generate. Yet something in Delilah's hopeful expression made the refusal stick in his throat. "I'll think about it," he said instead, tipping his hat before mounting Thunder. The week that followed found Zach in an unfamiliar state of indecision. He read Delilah's book in the evenings, surprising himself by enjoying the story more than he'd anticipated. During the days, as he worked his land and tended his cattle, he found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to the upcoming social and the invitation that hung in the air between them. On Friday, he rode to the creek that bordered his property and did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He bathed thoroughly, washed his hair, and afterward, looking at his reflection in the still water, made a decision. Saturday evening found him riding into Timber Creek, wearing his good suit, the one that had hung untouched in his wardrobe since Sarah's funeral. He'd shaved his beard down to a neat mustache and trimmed his hair, barely recognizing himself in the small mirror he dug out from a trunk. The schoolhouse glowed with lantern light, and the sounds of music and laughter spilled from its open doors. Horses and wagons clustered nearby, indicating a strong turnout from the surrounding areas. Zach sat atop Thunder for several minutes, almost turning back twice before finally dismounting and tying the horse to a post. He entered quietly, hoping to avoid notice, but in a town the size of Timber Creek, a man who'd been absent from social life for 3 years couldn't help but draw attention. Conversations paused as he moved through the crowd, and he heard his name whispered more than once. Just as he was considering the wisdom of a hasty retreat, Delilah appeared before him, resplendent in a dark green dress that matched her eyes. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I was hoping you would." "Said I'd think about it," he replied, awkwardly holding his hat in his hands. Her smile widened. "And I'm very glad your thoughts led you here. Come, let me introduce you to some people." Before he could object, she had taken his arm and was guiding him through the crowd. To Zach's surprise, the introductions were less painful than anticipated. Most folks seemed more curious than judgmental, and Delilah's easy manner helped smooth over the awkward moments. As the evening progressed, Zach found himself relaxing incrementally. He declined invitations to dance but accepted a plate of food and a cup of punch, eventually settling on a bench near the wall where he could observe without being too conspicuous. Delilah danced several times, her copper hair catching the light as she moved gracefully across the floor. Zach noticed he wasn't the only man watching her, and an unexpected pang of something like jealousy caught him off guard. Later, as the music slowed and many of the families with young children began to depart, Delilah made her way to his side, flushed from dancing and looking pleased with the evening's success. "The social has raised enough money to purchase new books and supplies for the school," she told him, sitting beside him with a contented sigh. "And Mrs. Henderson has agreed to help me teach the younger children." "Seems like the town needed someone like you," Zach observed. Delilah looked at him curiously. What a lovely thing to say. He shrugged, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Just the truth." "Walk me home?" she asked suddenly. Uncle Frank left early, his joints were bothering him, and it's only a short distance. The request was innocent enough, though Zach was aware of the speculative glances cast their way as they left the schoolhouse together. Timber Creek's main street was quiet now, most of its inhabitants either at the social or already home for the evening. They walked in companionable silence for a time, the spring night cool but pleasant. "I finished the book," Zach said eventually. "Did you enjoy it?" "I did. Been a while since I read anything new." Delilah smiled up at him.
"I'm glad."
"There's something special about losing yourself in a good story, isn't there? Like living another life for a little while." They reached the small house behind the general store where Delilah and her uncle lived. She turned to face him, her expression suddenly serious. "Thank you for coming tonight, Zachary. I know it couldn't have been easy for you." He nodded, unsure how to respond. "Would you tell me about them?" she asked softly. "Your family?" The question landed like a physical blow. Zach took a step back, his carefully maintained composure threatening to crack. "How did you—" "The silver hairbrush," she said gently. "And there was a small pair of boots in the trunk." "Too small for you." I noticed them when I stayed with you." Zach stood frozen, torn between the urge to flee and a strange, unexpected desire to speak the words he'd held inside for so long. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice rough. "My wife."
"And James."
"Our son." "Cheyenne Raid, 3 years ago. I was in town." The admission felt like ripping open a wound. "Should have been there." Delilah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her gaze remained steady. "It wasn't your fault, Zachary." "Wasn't there," he repeated, the guilt he'd carried for years evident in every syllable. Without warning, Delilah closed the distance between them and took his hand in hers. "And would Sarah want you to punish yourself forever? To live in silence and solitude because of something you couldn't control?" The directness of the question stunned him. No one had dared speak to him this way, not since it happened. The few who had tried to offer comfort had been met with such cold resistance that they'd quickly retreated. "You didn't know her," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "No," Delilah agreed softly. "But I know she must have been remarkable to have earned such enduring loyalty from a man like you. And I can't imagine she would want this half-life for you." Zach stood motionless, Delilah's hand still holding his, her words penetrating the armor he'd built around himself. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to consider what Sarah would think of what he'd become. "I don't know how to be any other way anymore," he admitted, the confession barely audible. Delilah squeezed his hand gently. "Perhaps you could start by coming to town more often. The store receives new books regularly. And she hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. "I would very much like to see you again." The invitation hung between them, offering something Zach had thought forever beyond his reach, a chance to step back into the world of the living. "I'll think about it," he said, echoing his response from before. This time, Delilah smiled knowingly. "I look forward to it." Summer bloomed across the Wyoming Territory, painting the rangeland in wildflowers and verdant grasses. In Timber Creek, the schoolhouse preparations continued, with classes set to begin in September. And at least once a week, the solitary figure of Zachary Powell could be seen riding into town, staying longer each time. His visits to the general store became a fixture of town life, no longer remarked upon with surprise. Frank Crawford welcomed him warmly, often engaging him in conversation about cattle prices or the railway's progress, while Delilah attended to other customers. But it was Delilah who recommended books, who asked about his week, who gradually drew him out of his shell with her genuine interest and lack of pretense. In July, when a traveling photographer set up shop in Timber Creek for a day, it was Delilah who convinced Zach to sit for a portrait, his first in years. In August, when she organized a picnic for the prospective students and their families to meet their new teacher, it was Zach who arrived early to help set up tables and stayed late to assist with the cleanup. Whispers began, of course. Small towns thrived on such speculation. But for once, Zach found he didn't mind. Let them talk. For the first time since losing his family, he had something to look forward to beyond mere survival. On a warm September evening, with the school term successfully underway, Zach invited Delilah to dinner at his cabin. He'd spent days fixing the broken chair that had sat unused in the corner, cleaning until every surface gleamed, even planting late summer flowers in a small plot beside the porch steps. He met her at the edge of his property, helping her down from the buggy she'd driven from town. She wore a simple blue dress that reminded him of the day they'd met, her copper hair pinned up but already threatening to escape in the gentle breeze. "Your land is beautiful in this light," she remarked as they walked toward the cabin. "Everything golden and peaceful." Zach nodded, seeing his property through her eyes not as a place of exile, but as the home it was meant to be. "Been thinking of expanding the herd next spring," he said. "Maybe building onto the cabin." Delilah glanced at him with interest. "Oh, planning for the future, then?" "Starting to," he admitted. Inside, he'd prepared a meal that stretched his limited cooking skills: venison stew, fresh bread he'd traded for in town, and blackberry cobbler using berries from the creek bank. They ate at the table by lamplight, the conversation flowing more easily than Zach would have thought possible 6 months ago. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. In the comfortable silence, Zach gathered his courage. "I've been alone a long time," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Thought that's all there was left for me. Then you broke a wheel outside my cabin." Delilah turned to face him, her expression open and attentive. "You brought something back I thought was gone for good," he continued. "Not just words, but
Purpose.
reason to look forward to tomorrow." He reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I'm not good with fancy speeches. But I care for you, Delilah. More than I thought possible. And, if you'd consider. That is, if you might feel—" "Yes," she interrupted, her eyes bright with emotion. "Yes, Zachary Powell, I would very much consider it. In fact, I've been considering it for quite some time." The simplicity of her acceptance, so characteristic of everything about her, flooded Zach with relief and joy in equal measure. He leaned forward hesitantly, and when she met him halfway, their first kiss felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Winter arrived, bringing with it the holiday season and a wedding in Timber Creek's small church. The entire town turned out to witness Zachary Powell and Delilah Crawford exchange vows, many remarking on the transformation of the once silent rancher who now stood tall beside his bride, his voice clear and firm as he pledged himself to her. Frank Crawford, beaming with pride, gave away the bride and announced that the newlyweds would take over running the general store, allowing him a well-deserved retirement. The news was met with approval. Zach's practical knowledge of ranching needs complemented Delilah's organizational skills and educational focus perfectly. As they departed the church amid cheers and well wishes, Zach helped Delilah into the sleigh that would carry them back to their cabin now for a brief honeymoon before they would take up residence in town. "Happy?" he asked as they glided over the snow-covered landscape, the sound of sleigh bells bright in the crisp air. Delilah nestled against him, her hand securely in his. "Completely." "And you?" Zach looked out over the rangeland he'd once roamed in silence, thinking of the future they would build together, the store, the school, perhaps children of their own one day. He thought of Sarah and James. No longer wounds too painful to acknowledge, but memories he could now honor without being consumed by grief. "More than I ever thought to be again," he answered truthfully, and as Delilah's laughter rose into the winter sky, Zach knew that the silence had finally been broken for good.